It's great to be back in the Bay Area. So just some quick background. My name's Scott Page. I'm a professor of complex systems at the University of Michigan and the Santa Fe Institute. So I'm sort of a strange person to talk about diversity. So let me give just a tiny bit of backstory. My training, as Roloff was mentioning game theory today, my training was in game theory at Northwestern's Business School. I moved into this field of complex systems studies, and in complex systems we study things like the brain, ecosystems, economies, traffic, that sort of stuff. And I'm working at Caltech, and then I moved to Michigan. When I moved to Michigan, I find out that they think about diversity in a completely different way. So at Caltech, diversity was this scientific thing. It was like, how does diversity make systems more robust? How does diversity make systems more innovative? Right? How does diversity sometimes lead systems to have catastrophic events? That sort of stuff. So it's purely scientific questions. And then I get to Michigan, and the story sort of changes. The story's sort of like this. It's this normative thing, that diversity is the right thing to do, that we should be inclusive, that sort of thing. So it's sort of like a C.P. Snow sort of moment, right? I know all these people on one side of campus that went at questions related to diversity purely mathematically, scientifically, computer simulations, that sort of stuff. And then all of a sudden I've got all these humanists at U of M, because Caltech, by the way, there aren't any humanists. There's 4 when I was there. And there was this just amazing sort of disconnect. And the disconnect can sort of be phrased like this, that from the normative perspective, I think sometimes what we do is we think of diversity as having some sort of trade-off with excellence, right? So I visited over the last decade, literally hundreds of companies, and people will say to me, well, how do I make the choice between sort of the qualified candidate, they might say, or the diverse candidate? And I'm like, whoa, okay, that's not right. Because if you think about it, if you have a complex problem, that's going to be my one message. If the problem is hard, if it's complex, if it's multidimensional, then excellence actually demands diversity. Okay? So the book that they hand out to you, this book called The Difference, I wrote 10 years ago. I've got a new book coming out called The Diversity Bonus, which I'll talk about today, has an unfortunate mathematical result in it. And it's called this. It's called diversity trumps ability. Okay? Label that, let it go. But the idea behind this theorem is, if you've got a really hard problem, and you sort of line up people and give them a test, if you take a group of the very best people and you compare them to a group of diverse people, the diverse group will actually do better. So why is it? Why is it that diversity makes us better? Well, the point is it doesn't always make us better. It makes us better on complex tasks. So this is some work by Cesar Hidalgo and Ricardo Hausman at MIT and Harvard. And this is a map of the economy. So each color is a different sector. And what you can see is the economy is now this sort of massive network of things. So one thing is things are just connected, they're diverse, they're adaptive, they move incredibly fast, right? The other reason why we need diversity is something that we call sort of the un-Milton point. And that is this. Milton was this amazing polymath, right? 17th century, he knew Galileo, he knew Newton, right? He went around, he spoke 7 languages, wrote in 12 languages. He, at the time, read almost every book that you could read. So if you sort of do the math on this, there are like 6,000 or 7,000 books published per decade. There was no internet, no TV. He was reading 2-3 books a day, sort of like the person I had dinner with last night. And if you do the math on that, he could read about 30,000 books during his life, and he pretty much read everything in the British Library. Last year, 2.5 million books were published. So really, no one can know much of anything. Even people who are sort of world experts know at most sort of a thin slice of what's going on. So it's these 2 things, the complexity of the world. Okay, there's 2 things. It's the complexity of the world, and also I've got 2 things now. This is very complex. So they hand me a third, I'm going to ask you to come up and help, all right? And the fact that there's just too much to know. So when economic historians talk about this, if you talk to someone like Joe Morcure or Robert Gordon, what they'll say is, look, the past was sort of like this. In the past, the economy consisted of things like chopping, riveting, and pounding. So this is a logging camp in northern Michigan. And Laszlo Bock, who I spent some time with at Google over the last couple of years, when he was at Google, they got over 3 million applicants a year. If they were hiring people to chop down trees, like these guys, if they lined these guys up, it'd be very easy for him to figure out who he should hire. What he should do is he should sort of say, how many trees can you chop down in a day? And this big dude can chop down 12, and the guy who's got the pipe obviously lacks the sort of lung capacity, so he's only going to chop down 8, and so he'd hire the guy who can chop down 12. The other thing, if you think about a team of people chopping down trees, right, these 5 people can basically chop down 50 trees. It's what we would call additive, or if you're a computer scientist, you'd call it separable, right? The team's total productivity just equals the sum of the people on the team. But that's not what we do now, right? What we do now is we think, we innovate, we explore. we basically work on incredibly complex tasks. So if you think about the firms that I've heard talking today, during lunches, yesterday at dinner, you're all doing incredibly complex things. They're high-dimensional things. You're solving problems. So one of the themes that people have talked a lot about is sort of diversity of thought, right? The idea of meritocracy, right? The idea of having different ways of thinking and representing problems in the room. Well, if you think about something like designing a car, and you think about hiring people, and you've got 3 candidates you're thinking about hiring, and you think about how you think about this car, well, you could give them some sort of test, and you could say, okay, how do you perform on this test? And each one of them gets some sort of score, but what you can't do is add up their IQs, right? There's no sense in which you could say the productivity of the team is just the sum of the IQs of these people. So a couple years ago, a friend of mine had become president of Cornell, and she asked if I'd come in and give a talk on the value of cognitive diversity at Cornell, and I said, fine. Before I show up, I get this email from this guy, John Kleinberg, who is a computer scientist. He's also a MacArthur Genius Award winner, which means he's smarter than me, I guess. And I had this paper with my friend Lu Hong, and it basically said this, that on difficult tasks, right, the best team doesn't consist of the best individuals. And this was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, so it's probably right? So as things go. And the thing is that John said, well, you know, I want to think about this in a different way. I want to say, like, to what extent is this really true? And so if you think about it, then you have to ask yourself, well, what do we mean by diversity? Right? So if I say, what do I mean that when I want diversity of thought in the room? I think the first thing you have to do is you sort of have to have a completely different metaphor. And instead of thinking of scales, right, instead of thinking about I can weigh your brain, I can give you an IQ score. Someone earlier today mentioned the idea of some sort of rubric that you apply and then give each person a score. That's really not the right way to think about it. Instead, what you want to do is you want to think about what sort of cognitive toolbox, what sort of cognitive repertoire do people have? So when you interview someone, you think, okay, what courses have they taken, right? Do they know calculus? Do they know organic chemistry? Do they know how to negotiate a contract, right? Do they speak French? Do they know Perl, Python? So instead of thinking of some person as some sort of like measuring stick or some sort of scale, what you want to do is you want to think of people as having sort of this sort of constellation of skills, understanding, tools, experiences, those sorts of things. And it's that diversity that gets applied to the problems. So when I think about diversity, one of the things that I really focus on is this idea that diversity actually gives us bonuses. So these differences in how we think actually give us sort of super additive effects. So let me explain this, because this is, I think, sort of important. A lot of times, people will talk about diversity mattering for the same reason you construct a diverse portfolio. So last week I was at BlackRock, and it took somebody about maybe 13 seconds to say that, right? We want diverse employees for the same reason we want a diverse portfolio. Wrong. Okay, let's think through the math. It's not very hard. If I invest in 4 stocks, tech stock, an oil stock, an airline stock, and an auto stock, I'm going to get the average of those 4 stocks. And the reason I put together a diverse portfolio and I compute the beta and all that other stuff is because I want to sort of minimize risk. I want to spread risk across different asset classes depending on what state of the world is realized. Right? That's the plan. Right? If I put together a diverse team and they have a bunch of ideas, so Astro hires a bunch of us to sort of think things through, I don't have to take everybody's ideas. So this idea, this one that looks like an L, could be lousy. Right? This could be a crappy idea. Well, guess what? We can dump it. Right? Now, we couldn't dump the airline stock from our portfolio. If we could, BlackRock would be doing even better than they are now. Right? You can't drop those things. But you can just basically take, if this is a bad idea, you can get rid of it. So when you think about having a diverse team throwing out ideas, you actually get the best idea from the team. And it's even better than that, because typically you have diverse people in the room, and if you've got, you know, Ray's idea meritocracy going on there, right, with full transparency, then it's going to be the case that you'll typically do even better than the best idea, right, because you can combine those ideas. Why is this important? Why is it important to think about getting better than the best idea as opposed to thinking of a portfolio? The reason why is if you're going to get better than the best, that means you probably want a lot more diversity than you'd want if you were going to get the average, right? Because diversity gives you bonuses, you actually really want to err on the side of diversity. So let's go back to Kleinberg, right? So the genius from Cornell. So I go to Cornell and I'm presenting this stuff. And he says, so I wrote this paper with a graduate student of mine, Maithra Raghu. And here's what we found. This is computer science speak. He says, we find families of submodular and supramodular team performance functions such that no test over individuals determines the optimal team. So what does that mean if you're not a genius computer scientist? So submodular and supramodular mean non-additive, mean non-separable, means we're not chopping down trees, right? So what they basically show is if the problem is complex, there's no rubric you can have. So it was a brilliant point raised earlier today, right? if you apply the same rubric to hire people, what you're doing is you're taking these high-dimensional toolboxes of people and projecting them onto a single dimension, and then hiring people who are going to be fairly similar. If you listen to what my friend Sheen Levine calls sort of the siren call of sameness, right? You hire people who look like you, think like you, went to the same school as you, that sort of stuff, right? What you're doing is you're taking high-dimensional people and putting them down on lower dimensions and then picking the best ones. What Kleinberg shows is that that will not give you optimal teams. In fact, it's guaranteed to not give you optimal teams, and the reason why is because you're throwing out all that diversity. So as Ann Arbor's very own Bob Seeger would say it a little bit more succinctly, I'm not a number, right? So you can't just assign numbers to people. So let me show you how these bonuses work, just in one example. So this is a steer, right? And a friend of mine, Jim Sawicki, wrote this book called The Wisdom of Crowds. And in this book, he talks about this 1906 West of England fat stock and poultry exhibition. 787 people guessed the weight of a steer. There's all these guesses, right? The average of these guesses is 1,197 pounds. The steer weighs 1,198 pounds. Okay, so in my book, The Difference, I explain why that works. And you can prove something called the diversity prediction theorem that says crowd error equals average error minus diversity. Now, a couple years ago, Ohio State won the national championship in football, and they had these bracelets on that said O equals E plus M, like output equals effort plus meaning or something, right? Okay, that's crap. I mean, that's just like made up, like team equals thoroughness plus effort plus ability plus meaning or something, right? This is like real math. So this is just true, okay? So this is like the Pythagorean theorem, right? So this is saying, this is the crowd's error, this is the average error of the people in it. Now you might think, oh, the crowd is as good as the average person in it. That's not true. If you do the math, the crowd is actually smarter than the average person in it, and the amount by which the crowd is smarter than the average person in it is equal to the diversity of the crowd. So think of this compared to the portfolio, right? In the portfolio, you do as well as the average stock. With a crowd, you do as well as the average person plus the diversity. So let's look at the people in Galton steers, people guessing the weight of Galton steer. It could have been that these were like cattle weight guessing savants from the west of England, right? That would be a possibility. Well, let's go to the data, right? Here's what the data show. The crowd is off by less than a pound. These are squared errors, right? So the crowd is off by a pound. On average, people are off by about 70 pounds. So they weren't cattle weight guessing savants. They were no better than we were. Why did the crowd get it right? Because they were diverse. So let's do some really simple math. If you have a really hard problem, a complex problem, then by definition, no one's going to get it right. So if no one's going to get it right, this number is going to be big. If this number is going to be big, and you want this number to be small, the only way to do that is to make this number big. So the point is, right, if you've got complex tasks, diversity isn't a feel-good thing, it's a sensible thing. Okay, so let me do some big data. Now, social science has had this transformational change over the last 10 years. So when I first got into this thing, it's called work, I guess, right? Social scientists, a lot of our results would be like 30 undergraduates in a lab who at the end of it got coffee cups for participating or something, right? Now, if you listen carefully, you can hear social scientists scraping the web, right? So now we just have these enormous data sets. So let me just show you two. So this is 28,000 forecasts by professional economists over 40 years over 6 economic indicators. This is basically any data you can get on professional economists making predictions, and this is work by Jack Soll and some colleagues. If you look at this and you average all the economists who made predictions, they're 21% better than the average economist. Now you might think, heck, I could be 21% better than the average economist. Okay, and that could be true. But what you can also do is this. You can say, let's take the very best economist and compare the very best predictor to the very best predictor combined with the second best predictor. And what happens if you average the second best with the best, you end up doing 8% better. Right? 8% better. Why? Well, look, you know the second best predictor is worse than the best predictor, but the reason you get the bonus is they're also different. If you look at mutual funds, it used to be 75% of mutual funds were run by one person. Now 75% of mutual funds are run by teams. That's because teams get 60 basis points better, right? The same is true for women-run funds. Women and men-run funds do better than men-run funds. And let me just do one final piece of data, and then I'll stop. If you look at academic research, in 1960, the modal paper was written by one person. There were 20,000 papers written by one person. In 2016, the modal paper is written by more than 5 people. So there's more papers written by 6 to 11 people than there are by 1 person or 2 person. Now the question is, you could say, why is that, right? And the reason why is this. If you look at team-authored papers versus solo-authored papers, and you ask, what's your odds of hitting a home run? So a home run paper is a paper that gets 100 citations. So if you want to get tenure at Stanford or Michigan or Chicago or Yale, when you go up for tenure, you better have a couple papers that have 100 citations, right? Team-authored papers in the science and engineering and in social science are 5 times as likely to reach this threshold than solo-authored papers. So that's why teams, because the fact is teams are winning. So Laszlo said, when are diverse teams successful? They're successful when they have a shared sense of mission. Well, this is a case where people have a huge shared sense of mission. They're trying to advance knowledge. Let me just end with this. If you look at patents, in the 19th century, 50% of patents pulled from a single patent classification. So they were within a single area. Now only 12% of patents do. So what's happening is, right, as the problems become harder, you need more and more cognitive diversity in order to solve these problems. Okay, so let me stop there, and I just want to end with one point that Adam mentioned when I was coming out. People talk a lot now about diversity and inclusion as opposed to just diversity. And the point here, and I think it's sort of a subtle one in some sense, diversity is that idea of bringing diverse people into the room. Inclusion is about creating a culture and a space where those diverse people can thrive, right? And I think one of the real interesting challenges and opportunities is how do you create a corporate culture where you can allow that diversity to do amazing things? And I don't think there's one way. So the place I'm at, Michigan, our approach seems to be a little bit Downton Abbey to me, right? Like everybody's very kind and gracious. Ray's approach is a little bit more combative, right? So I think one of the challenges for people in this room when running your own companies is to think about how do we create a place within our organizations where we can really leverage diversity the right way. All right, thank you very, very much.